The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Laurence Shames. I'm Bruce Southworth, a mystery book reviewer for Publishers Weekly and Rood Review. Laurence Shames has written several novels, Florida Straits and Sunburn, most recently published by Hyperion in March of 1995, both featuring an aging mafia don. Another mystery, Scavenger Reef, and he's also tried his hand at nonfiction works, including The Big Time, a story of the Harvard Business School of 1949, the class of 1949, and The Hunger for More, searching for value in a culture of greed. Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Bruce, nice to be here.
As I mentioned, one of the main characters in Sunburn and in Florida Straits is aging mafia don Vincent, or is it Vincente?
Vincente.
Vincente, okay, Delgado, and he's a delightful character, but I wanted to ask you first about another character in the book, Artie Magnus, who is ghosting Vincente's memoirs,
right,
which causes a lot of problem with some of the other people in the organized crime group. And I know you've ghosted a book, The Boss of Bosses,
That's
also
correct.
on the mafia. Would it be fair to say that perhaps you appear in the book as Artie Magnus? Would that be?
Well, there are similarities and there are differences. Artie is a newspaperman. He's city editor of a made-up newspaper called the Key West Sentinel. And Artie is a very frustrated writer. He's tired of being a newspaperman. He's bored with facts. He's always wanted to write a book, and he hasn't done it. And in that way, Artie and I differ greatly, because I've been writing books, or at least things it amused me to think of as books, really since I was in college. Artie has the same yearnings that I have. Fortunately for me, I seem to have a little bit better discipline than Artie does, or maybe I've just been luckier. But certainly the experience of being a ghostwriter comes a lot from my own experience. And it's a fascinating process, because you're put in a position where you're sort of airlifted into the middle of someone else's life, and you have to see the world through someone else's eyes, and you have to tell a story in someone else's voice. And perhaps most compellingly and most interestingly, you really have to see things from someone else's perspective. You have to make judgments according to someone else's morality rather than your own. And if the person you're ghostwriting for happens to be a mafia godfather, that calls for some very interesting and challenging ethical gymnastics.
It's quite a leap.
Yes, and putting Artie in a position where he had to do all that in order to fulfill this lifelong goal of writing a book was interesting to me as a writer, and you're absolutely right that I did draw on some of my own experiences as a ghostwriter and some of my own ambivalence about the whole idea of ghostwriting.
The book that you did right now, that was with a couple of FBI agents, as I understand
yes,
it?
Yes, there were two FBI agents, Joe O'Brien and Andy Kearns. They were the authors of record. And they had a marvelous idea for a book based on an investigation that they themselves had done. It was an investigation into the activities of Paul Castellano, who was the godfather before John Gotti. And in fact, John Gotti is now in prison for life for, among other things, masterminding the rub-out of Paul Castellano. So in the course of doing that book, I had a very privileged glimpse at the upper echelons of the real-life mafia, as well as the real, as opposed to the textbook, procedures of the FBI. And I came to feel a grudging, complicated, but real respect for Paul Castellano. He was, by his, if you grant him certain premises, he was an honorable man, he was loyal, he had had a violent past, but in his later years he really was a peacemaker and a diplomat. and there were a lot of things. He felt things deeply. He had a very rich emotional life. He had a very strong sense of family, and there was a lot to admire at the same time as there was a whole heck of a lot to disapprove of. But some of those feelings that I had about Paul Castellano find their way into Vincente Delgado, and I like to think that that is what makes Vincente a multi-dimensional and a sympathetic character in the novels.
That's one of the things that I particularly liked is his, he almost has a tiredness in his voice at times about the notion, kind of the popular notion of the mafia that people have of Al Capone and so on, and people running around in gang wars and shooting. And I love the description in the book where he was telling Artie, it's not about killing, it's not about this, it's about authority. And he brings it all the way back to the history of all the invasions in Sicily and the origins of Cosa Nostra. And that, combined with the intent that he had to write the book for his sons to sort of explain himself. I mean, it makes him a very real and a human kind of character with family values and tradition and so on.
No, well, thank you. You know, Vincente, as Sunburn opens, Vincente is almost bursting with the weight and the pressure of all these secrets that he's had to keep for his entire life, because by definition, the mafia is a secret organization. And Vincente, being someone who takes the code of honor very seriously, has kept these secrets, has never let out anything, but he's also in a position where people are always telling him things. Anyone can unburden themselves to the Godfather. The Godfather is not allowed to unburden himself to anyone, and so he's in an excruciating position. And when he finally decides that he will write his memoirs, he has very strong ground rules. He's not going to give away the deep, dark secrets of crimes. He's not going to put anyone in jail. What he wants to talk about is the profounder philosophical aspect of what this is all about. And you're absolutely right in saying that it goes back to the whole history of Sicily, which was invaded over and over and over and over again. So Sicilians never knew what the law was going to be the next year. They never knew who was going to be ruling them. And so historically speaking, Cosa Nostra developed simply as a way of maintaining their own ethnic identity and as a way of having some control over their own lives.
It's my understanding that some of the first elements of that secret society made their way to New York in the late 1800s. I don't know if it had historically been here before that, but one history that I'd read indicated that. And I was kind of curious if, given the research that you've done both for Boss of Bosses and for Sunburn, if you've seen major shifts in the philosophy or the activity of Cosa Nostra, say in the last 100 years or so.
Well, I'd say that the most major shift is that Cosa Nostra has gone from being what we might call a full, round, complete philosophical system, basically to an excuse for criminal activity. And I want to make it clear that although I have a certain almost nostalgic appreciation for the mafia, you know, it's like for a time the good old bad old days when even the bad guys weren't all that terrible.
This is honor among thieves.
Right, right. You know, I certainly don't condone the criminal activity, and it's an interesting and complex question because on the one hand, I think people really can understand how Cosa Nostra started. It was meant basically as a mutual defense kind of organization. Now we're in a situation where I guess most of us would say that our government functions with some degree of fairness, law enforcement functions with some degree of fairness. They're not justified now they can't say now, oh yes, we're criminals because we must be criminals. They're criminals because they choose to be criminals. they enjoy it, they make more money, and so that's a major shift.
Yeah. I've kind of been wondering sometimes too if some of the younger people as they come up, not within the Cosa Nostra, but some of the other gangs, other ethnic groups or whatever, are kind of eroding at the former importance of the people in the Cosa Nostra.
Oh, that's absolutely true. The mafia is much less powerful than it was even 20 years ago, and there are basically two reasons for that, or I would say basically three reasons. One reason is that the FBI in particular, other law enforcement groups as well, have mounted some extremely successful prosecutions that basically have dismantled the whole upper echelon of mafia leadership. The second thing that has really weakened the mafia's power is the rise of other ethnic gangs, which, by the way, tend to be more violent, more random in their violence, and scarier than the mafia ever was. And the third thing that has happened is a breakdown of discipline within the mafia itself among the younger members. For example, until 20 or so years ago, mafiosi never took drugs. Drugs were a commodity. They were to be sold to other people who would then be the victims. The mobsters themselves did not take drugs. There is now a younger generation of mobsters in the major cities of the East, at least, who they want to be hip. So they're taking drugs. So there's a breakdown in discipline. There's a breakdown in the whole family structure. And one of the reasons that it's possible for me to exploit the mafia for comic purposes, because Florida Straits and Sunburn are funny novels. At least I hope they are, because I failed if they're not.
No, you succeeded.
One of the reasons it's possible to use the mafia in comic terms is because it isn't that powerful anymore. It isn't that dangerous anymore. If it was truly dangerous, if these people were truly evil and violent, you couldn't be funny about it. And I think you can be funny about the mafia now.
Yeah, it seems that you've been able to take that kind of a view and also play with some of the stereotypes with Gino, who is the legitimate son of Vincente, and Joey, who is the illegitimate son, and Joey's out of the family and he's doing his own thing. But Gino seems to be that out of control element. He's almost sort of representing this new younger generation that doesn't seem to have the respect and trying to do his own thing, make his own way, no matter what. But I also like the balance that you achieve by, it's almost like there is a balance. Gino against Mark Sutton. Is that the FBI agent's
Mark
name?
Mark Sutton, yes.
Whereas with the good guys versus the bad guys, you've got Vincente on one hand and Ben Hawkins, the older FBI agent, both just trying to, let everything go along without rocking the boat, and then Mark and Gino, who are out there to make a name for themselves.
Right.
So there's kind of a lot of balancing going on. They're very interesting characters.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't really thought of this until you just put it that way. But I guess I find it much easier to be nice to my older characters than to my younger characters. Because Vincente, who's an old man, is a sympathetic guy. Bert the Shirt, who we haven't mentioned yet, was a very old man and a very lovable character. Ben Hawkins, the older FBI agent, admirable, good cop. And Mark Sutton is the kind of overeager, he'll do anything to make himself a career kind of crummy cop.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got Gino, who's he's such a rotten guy. I mean, he's stupid, he's selfish, he's beastly with women. I mean, he's a pretty bad guy.
Yeah, he's sort of a modern Dorian Gray. Bert the Shirt, I'm glad you mentioned him. He's literally one of my favorite characters in the book. I just loved listening to him, and the way you introduce him, the fact that he'd been living in Key West for 10 years, and one of the reasons was because he'd been killed 10 years before that or something. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it.
Yes,
but
he died.
Yeah.
He died. Well, you see, you can't retire from the mafia. When you're initiated, one of the things that's said is that you come in alive, you go out dead. And some years before the action of the book takes place, Bert had a very difficult day. In fact, he had to go to court and testify. And he's walking up the courthouse steps, and he was under a great deal of stress, and he had a heart attack. And he was dead for 20 seconds, and they brought him back to life. And he took his electrocardiogram with the flat place on it to his boss, and he said, "Look, you get out when you die. I died. I'm out of here. Let me retire. Early retirement."
That is great.
So and that's the only way you can retire from the mob.
Yeah. And of course his constant companion, Don Giovanni.
Don Giovanni.
The constipated, aged Chihuahua.
Yes, that poor dog. He
Yeah.
somehow keeps rolling along, but I don't know how many more books I can keep him alive. I mean, he's a pretty decrepit old dog by now.
Probably a long time. I know I related probably better to Bert in some respects because I had a Chihuahua when I was younger. He grew to be very old, and he was constipated, so I mean I could relate to this. I just loved him dearly. I wanted to also should shift kind of to your nonfiction works a little bit and make sure we talk about some of that. The The Big Time, the book that discusses the 1949 Harvard Business School class. Was it 650 some men who ultimately had major influence over business in America?
That's right. That's right.
How did you come to write that?
Well, I think this is going to require a somewhat long answer, but I'll try not to make it too long.
Okay. Well, I can leave and come back, I suppose.
I originally set out to be a novelist. That's the first thing I wanted to do. That was my boyhood ambition. But I was a terrible failure at it for about 8 or 10 years. Just unblemished record of failure. And I backed into being a magazine writer, which I never intended. But magazine writing came relatively easily, and I was making a career out of that relatively easily. And one of the things that I did as a magazine writer was to write the ethics column for Esquire. And I did that in 1982 and 1983. And that column really had a considerable following. And one day, I received a call from an editor at what was then Harper & Row, has since become HarperCollins. And she said to me, "You don't know me. I'm a fan of the ethics column. We have a book that's already been approved by the editorial board. We'd love for you to write it. Will you do it?" Now, this simply does not happen in the life of a writer. I almost thought it was a crank call. I mean, it's
amazing.
For someone you don't know to call you up and say, "Just sign here," and you have your first book contract. So I said, "Well, yes, of course I want to do it." But I felt honor-bound to make certain disclaimers. And I said, "Look, I'm not a Harvard guy. I'm not a business school guy. I'm not an MBA. I don't know much about business. And by the way, I'm not terribly impressed with American capitalism." And she said, "For all those reasons, you're the perfect person to write the book." So I felt like I had made a clean breast of it, and now they were turning me loose to write this book.
It's it has a very conversational feel to it. It's not when I first saw it, I thought this is going to be very dry, discussing the life and achievement of these people and so on. And it's not that at all. It's it's also a very humorous book in a lot of respects because of what you bring out for a lot of the people. I guess one of the things I was wondering, did you come to any particular conclusions as to why this particular class and not necessarily any other particular group of people met with the success that they did? Was it strictly the time that they were in?
I think it was 95% timing. Harvard Business School had suspended all classes during the Second World War, and they didn't really resume regular classes until 1947. So the class that graduated in 1949 came after, I think it was an 8-year drought of MBAs. So they were the first batch of new MBAs. Also, keep in mind that in 1949, there were many, many, many fewer schools offering the MBA degree. So a Harvard MBA, not only was it very prestigious, but it was just very rare to have an MBA degree at all. So these guys came, and I say guys because it was all men then. The school didn't go co-ed until the 60s. They came out into this very essentially unpopulated field at the very beginning of a quarter century of almost unbroken growth. So they worked hard. I'm not taking anything away from how hard they worked, but they were just so lucky to have that degree at that time and launch themselves into corporate American business at that juncture.
So many of them, from the descriptions that I've read, were just so incredibly hungry to get into the school. The people were just persistent and insistent that that's where they were going to go and that's what they were going to do. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, they were a hugely ambitious group, partly because they felt that they had lost time to the war.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them were veterans, and they, instead of going out and starting their careers at 21 or 22, which was sort of the norm for that generation, they were feeling, oh my God, I'm 25 and I don't know what I'm going to do yet, and I better work that much harder to make up for that lost time. They were hugely motivated.
Mm. As opposed to now, people are 30 and 40 and still wondering what they're going to be when they grow up.
Exactly.
It's pretty scary. The other book that you've written,
Hunger for More.
Hunger for More, thank you. It's just lost it there for a moment. That one I'm not familiar with. I haven't been able to find a copy to look at. So could you tell me a little bit about that? It sounds like it ties in very nicely with the mafia in a way. I mean, this hunger for more and the culture of greed. And
yeah, well, in a way, Hunger for More also ties in with my experience as the ethics columnist,
mm-hmm.
and in an oblique way, it almost follows The Big Time. The Hunger for More is essentially a book-length essay, some might say a book-length tirade,
mm-hmm.
About yuppies, greed, Wall Street, the whole 1980s ethos of money, 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 business, 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 career, career, career. And I was deeply offended by all of that. I thought that young people were basically being suckered into making terrible decisions in personal terms.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people were rushing into careers blindly, going into finance, not because they had any real interest in it, not because it would be rewarding or interesting, but simply because that was where the fast buck was to be made. And there was so much social pressure and peer pressure
mm-hmm.
about that. And I thought it was a calamitous time. And I never intended to write that book. I wrote a little 800-word op-ed piece for the New York Times about how the word success was being dreadfully misused and drained of its meaning in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
The word success refers to an achievement, an accomplishment, something of substance.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1980s, all success meant was well paid. Are you getting paid a lot of money? That's all that success meant. It deeply offended me. Aside from anything else, it was such an appallingly sloppy use of language. And I wrote this little 800-word essay, got
mm-hmm.
it off my chest, and I thought, well, I've had my say about the 80s. And to my great surprise, I received calls from a number of book editors saying, this needs to be a book. And until that, I truly hadn't thought about writing it as a book. And I got turned loose on that and had a pretty good time with it for a couple of years. But at the same time, it cured me of writing serious social commentary, basically because I worked so hard on that book.
Mm-hmm.
It was very well received by reviewers and the media, but it really was an incredibly tough sell. The reason being that I was asking people to shell out $20 to be told that they were wasting their lives. And you can't say to someone, drop $20 on the counter and I'll give you 300 pages of bad news.
Yeah, why you've just misspent the last several years of your life doing something.
Yeah.
That would be a bit hard to swallow. I know this is going to sound like we're shifting gears a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about an aspect of both. Well, I won't say both, but the Big Time in particular. As I said, it has almost a fictional flavor to it, a very easy read in that sense, and there's so much that's based in reality in Sunburn as well, and I'm sure Florida Straits. And do you find that there's a fuzzier line than maybe you anticipated between fiction and nonfiction? That one flows over into the other more easily than maybe at first you thought?
I think the line is almost non-existent. Some people think you've got fiction over here and nonfiction over there, and it's two different kinds of writing.
Mm-hmm.
it's so similar. Um, my feeling is that the writer's first responsibility is to tell a story and to entertain and to create characters that the reader will be interested in and care about, and to create, whatever you're writing, you have to give the reader a reason to turn the page. You have to give the reader, there has to be tension, there has to be conflict, there has to be movement. Characters have to grow and develop. And I think those requirements are there whether it's nonfiction or fiction. I felt that when I came back to writing novels, I felt that a lot of what I had learned from writing the nonfiction translated 100%. You have to keep the reader interested. You have to make it fun. And I think those are exactly the same skills.
Yeah, I was recently reading a biography that if I hadn't known that it was a biography, it could be a fictional novel. The characters are so very interesting and lively, and I think that seems to be very true. I want to shift again very briefly and ask you about the Southern Florida writing community. There seem to be lots of good writers springing up from Florida. Yourself, Randy White, Carl Hyacin, John D. MacDonald many years ago, of course, and all the way back to Hemingway, particularly in your area. What is it that attracts good writers to that part of the country, aside from probably the weather, or is that the main draw?
Well, the weather is certainly part of it. I know that that's kind of a mundane answer, but you know, one of the wonderful things about the writing life is that it's so portable, and writers like to be warm. But aside from that, I do think there are certain things about Florida that make it very amenable to fiction, and especially to kind of quirky, funny, slightly strange, in some cases, crime fiction, not only crime fiction. But, you know, Florida is a place that has grown so fast that in social terms, the clay isn't yet dry. The rules are not really set, or if they seem to be set, they're changing all the time. And particularly in Key West, which is where I live as well as where I set my novels, it's the end of the line. Key West is literally the end of the road. And end of the road places always attract a kind of strange mix of people.
I have to interrupt. I think it's a perfect place to say this. We've this strange mix of people that's been attracted, we've come to the end of our road. We've exhausted our half an hour. Laurence Shames, thank you very much. The newest book is Sunburn. I'll put it here. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.